Governments around the world have access to literally trillions of dollars, some of the most brilliant minds on the planet, and resources that most of us can honestly only ever dream of. Naturally, you'd expect this incredible combination of infinite capital and unparalleled intellect to produce world-changing innovations. And, to be fair, it often does. But what happens when the pressure dials up to an unbearable level? Well, today we're exploring a completely different side of government innovation. We are looking at the absolute absurdity that emerges when massive bureaucracies hit the panic button. Okay, let's dive right into this. Infinite funding usually gets us incredible things, right? We're talking GPS, the internet, space travel, groundbreaking stuff. But under the intense pressure of geopolitical crises, military paranoia, or just sheer desperation, we get something entirely different. We get projects that sound less like cutting-edge science and more like fever dreams scribbled on a napkin at 3 in the morning. I am talking about cybernetic spy cats and declaring literal military war on giant flightless birds. These are completely real historical events, and today, in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how they happen.
Section 1. Weaponizing the Animal Kingdom.
So what exactly happens when the military bureaucracy tries to enlist nature into its ranks? Well, spoiler alert. Nature usually wins. To find our first project, we have to travel all the way back to 1932 in Western Australia. Following the First World War, the Australian government offered land grants to returning soldiers to turn them into wheat farmers. But by 1932, the Great Depression had hit. Wheat prices had completely plummeted, and subsidies dried up. And then, a vanguard of roughly 20,000 highly athletic flightless birds known as emus arrived in the wheat belt. They tore through fences, they devastated the crops. Desperate, these veteran farmers completely bypassed local agricultural authorities and went straight to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, requesting the deployment of machine guns. Pierce readily agreed, basically thinking it would be great target practice for his troops. The campaign was led by Major Meredith, who very quickly realized that rapid-fire automatic weapons are actually quite useless against giant turkeys that completely refuse to stand still. When fired upon, the emus just ignored standard military ambush tactics. Instead, they scattered into these small, lightning-fast guerrilla bands, easily outrunning the range of the guns. Even when the troops mounted a Lewis machine gun to the back of a truck, the ride was so incredibly bumpy they couldn't aim, and one massive emu actually got tangled in the steering gear, crashing the truck right into a fence. By December 1932, after wasting 10,000 rounds of ammunition, the military had to retreat. Major Meredith famously praised the emus, stating that they face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks, a humiliating, if hilarious, defeat for the military. Now, fast forward a bit to the 1960s, and we see how the bureaucracy evolved during the Cold War. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology comes up with Project Acoustic Kitty. The working theory? Cats are unassuming and can wander into restricted areas totally undetected. So why not turn one into a living wiretap? In an absolutely bizarre surgery, scientists implanted a tiny microphone directly into a cat's ear canal, placed a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and ran a thin wire antenna all the way down beneath the fur of its tail. And the cost of this feline espionage program? A staggering estimated $20 million. It took 5 long years of research and highly complex procedures to refine this cybernetic upgrade. Actually, they even had to perform secondary surgeries just to suppress the cat's natural hunger, desperately hoping to prevent their multi-million-dollar secret agent from abandoning a high-stakes Soviet surveillance mission just to, chase a stray mouse. So, the million-dollar, or rather $20 million question is, did it work? Well, the CIA handlers took their high-tech cat to a park outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. for its very first real-world field test. They opened the van door, the cat took a few steps, and, depending on which declassified account you believe, it was either immediately struck and killed by a passing taxi, or the handlers quickly realized that cats are just fundamentally untrainable. Either way, the project was a massive, expensive failure, leading to a hilariously understated bureaucratic conclusion that was declassified in 2001. It officially stated that trained cats simply would not lend itself in a practical sense to our highly specialized needs. Section 2. Disasters in the sky. All right, let's move from the ground in the animal kingdom up into the atmosphere, where the sky literally was the limit for bureaucratic panic. Here is the terrifying dilemma the U.S. military faced in 1961. How exactly do you secure international military communications if the Soviet Union cuts the deep-sea cables, or worse, vaporizes the Earth's ionosphere with a high-altitude nuclear blast? To solve this, scientists at the MIT Lincoln Lab dreamed up a highly unusual backup plan known as Project Westford. Their solution? Absolutely shocking. 480 million microscopic copper needles. The plan was to launch nearly 500 million of these tiny needles, each one thinner than a human hair, straight into orbit around the Earth. Once dispersed, they would create a massive, permanent, artificial metallic ring in space. This ring would act as a synthetic ionosphere, allowing the military to bounce radio signals back to Earth, completely independent of whatever nuclear chaos was happening in the natural atmosphere. And crazy enough, while the first launch in 1961 failed, the second one in 1963 actually worked. They created an artificial metallic ring and successfully transmitted voice signals between California and Massachusetts. However, while the military celebrated, global astronomers were absolutely horrified. British and Soviet scientists were furious, rightly arguing that 480 million pieces of metal would obscure telescopes and create massive hazards for spaceflight. The international fury over this orbital sewing project was so intense that it permanently changed space law, directly helping to shape the 1967 Outer Space Treaty to ensure absolutely no country could unilaterally litter the cosmos again.
But that panic quickly built into something even more terrifying. In 1957, the U.S. launched Project Pluto to build the supersonic low-altitude missile, also known as SLAM. This was designed to be the loudest, messiest weapon ever conceived. Unlike a conventional jet engine that relies on chemical fuel, the SLAM was a ramjet cruise missile powered by an unshielded nuclear Tory reactor. Because nuclear fuel lasts so incredibly long, this missile had virtually unlimited range.
The mechanics of this literal doomsday machine are just horrific. First off, it would fly at treetop level at Mach 3, dropping up to 16 hydrogen bombs on its targets. Second, just flying that fast and low would produce a 150 decibels sonic boom. That is loud enough to rupture eardrums, shatter buildings, and physically kill people on the ground with the pressure wave alone. And third, because the nuclear reactor was unshielded to save weight, the engine would continuously spew highly radioactive fallout directly out of its exhaust over every single square mile it flew past. Even empty of bombs, it would just fly in circles over enemy territory in a radioactive death lap until it eventually crashed. Shockingly enough, scientists actually successfully tested the Tory reactor in the Nevada desert. But thankfully, the Pentagon canceled Project Pluto on July 1st, 1964. Why? Well, mostly because there was absolutely no safe way to flight test it without heavily contaminating their own territory. Plus, deploying it in war would trigger an immediate, total nuclear retaliation from the Soviet Union. It was simply too terrifying to ever let off the ground. Section 3. Chemical and Psychological Absurdities. Transitioning from doomsday machines to, highly unconventional doctrines. Reeling from the trauma of the Vietnam War, the U.S. Army began looking for new ways to modernize. In 1979, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon, who had actually spent years studying New Age philosophies out in California, presented an operations manual to military leaders proposing an elite unit of super soldiers known as the 1st Earth Battalion. Shannon envisioned these soldiers as warrior monks. They were to be trained in Eastern martial arts and medication. But it goes much further than that. They were supposed to learn how to walk through solid walls, read minds, and remote view enemy locations from thousands of miles away. In combat, they would use non-lethal weapons like projecting positive music from speakers or carrying cages of baby lambs to release into enemy lines to inspire peace. And amazingly, the military took this seriously. Major General Albert Stubblebine poured millions into Project Stargate to research psychic espionage, which led to those infamous experiments at Fort Bragg where Special Forces soldiers literally tried to kill goats just by staring at them. And this brings us to our final entry. In 1994, the Wright Laboratory drafted a proposal requesting $7.5 million for what they called harassing, annoying, and bad guy identifying chemicals. This included the gay bomb, which proposed spraying enemy troops with a potent aphrodisiac to induce mutual homosexual attraction, supposedly to completely destroy military discipline and morale. They also proposed a halitosis bomb, meant to give enemy soldiers severe, chronic bad breath so they couldn't blend in with civilians. And, my personal favorite, a bee pheromone bomb specifically designed to attract angry swarms of wasps directly to the enemy's position. Now, these files were entirely real, and they were uncovered in 2004 by the Sunshine Project Watchdog Group via a Freedom of Information Act request.
The Pentagon tried to claim it was just a brainstorm paper that never received actual funding, but the sheer absurdity of the ideas earned the Air Force the 27 Ig Nobel Peace Prize. That's a satirical award given for achievements that first make people laugh and then make them think. Unsurprisingly, absolutely no one from the military showed up to accept the award.
Section 4. The bureaucracy of panic. You know, it is incredibly easy to laugh at these projects in hindsight, but they offer such a fascinating look at the bureaucracy of panic. In times of intense global competition, fear pushes otherwise completely logical bureaucrats to look at a stray cat, an angry emu, or a literal box of copper needles and think, hey, that just might be a viable military strategy. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. But I want to pass the question over to you. Which of these ridiculous government projects did you find the most absurd?
Please like and subscribe.